Hello and welcome to another learning episode of the PJ Pod, brought to you by the Pharmaceutical Journal, the official journal of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. I'm Research and Learning Editor Katherine Sole, and in this episode, we'll be talking about the importance of speaking up whenever anyone in the pharmacy team has a safety or wellbeing concern, and how to go about it. Around 25,000 people report safety concerns regarding the NHS each year. The most common reports are of inappropriate behaviours and attitudes, worker safety and wellbeing issues, and bullying and harassment. High-profile inquiries like the Winterbourne View Hospital Review and the Francis Report of Patient Safety Failings at Mid Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust have resulted in significant reforms and structural changes to the way patient care is delivered. Both are examples of change coming after someone blew the whistle on their concerns. In both cases, the whistleblowers felt they needed to speak up publicly, and the media played a central role. One of the recommendations in the Francis Report was that a new national system be established to make speaking up about a safety concern easier and embed it into healthcare's organisational culture. The National Guardian's Office was set up in 2016 to give people working in healthcare a way to speak up if they don't feel they can within their organisation. Every NHS trust and many other organisations now have a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. Within healthcare, we're moving away from the term whistleblowing. Traditionally, whistleblowing can be thought of as when someone speaks out about serious wrongdoing that can harm patients, colleagues or organisations. But this term has some negative connotations, and it's now preferred to use the broader term of speaking up. Having said that, the term whistleblowing is still widely used and will be referred to in this podcast. So for this episode, we spoke to some experts in the field to find out what someone in a pharmacy team should know if they're thinking about speaking up. Beth Carter is the Interim Director of Operations and Strategy at the National Guardian's Office. I asked Beth, what sort of problems should pharmacists report if they see them?
So it could be absolutely anything. It could be a very specific patient safety incident. So if we're thinking about pharmacists, maybe they're seeing some repeated drug errors or issues with medication storage, anything around that. But it could also be anything like inappropriate behaviours from other colleagues, whether directly in their department or elsewhere that they're seeing. It could be bullying, harassment, discrimination. It could be consistently low staffing levels, anything at all that they feel is impacting on them performing their role to the best of their ability.
Mark Pitt is a pharmacist and the Director of Defence Services at the Pharmacists Defence Association, an independent UK trade union with over 40,000 members. He gave some more examples of what pharmacists should be reporting.
For example, an employer has neglected their duty of care towards patients, their customers or staff. Another area that can be reported is a miscarriage of justice for somebody being dismissed for something that actually wasn't their fault. It was an error from another system. Another quite common one is somebody's health and safety being put in danger. And examples of those that are pharmacy specific: supplying out-of-date medicines, reusing patient returns, counterfeit medicines, unsafe storage conditions for medicines, fridge not working properly, and other examples, things like asbestos being in the building which is being worked upon. So those are sort of more pharmacy specific examples. And finally, there's damage to the environment. An employer, for example, has been disposing of returned or out-of-date medicines inappropriately, or occasionally you get pharmacies who find in the cellar some old historic stock of poisons, arsenic or mercury containing products, and there are very strict regulations about how those are disposed of, and if that's done inappropriately, just flushed down the toilet, that can cause environmental damage. So those are the principal areas, and also overarching all of those is if there's any attempts to cover up any of those type of qualifying disclosure.
So there are clearly lots of reasons that you might want to speak up, but I wanted to know whether pharmacists have an actual obligation to report problems. Here's Beth again.
The General Pharmaceutical Council has different standards for pharmacists, 9 different standards that they need to comply by. One of those standards is to speak up about concerns. So it is part of their professional responsibilities to speak up about concerns. But I think also it's a moral obligation. You know, if you see something that's not right, thinking about the impact it might have on other workers or patient safety, etc., it's really important that the pharmacist, you know, does try and find somebody to speak up to.
These standards apply to all pharmacy professionals, including pharmacy technicians who are registered in their own right. I asked what could happen if you don't report a problem.
You know, worst case scenario could be absolutely catastrophic. With the failings that we've seen across the healthcare sector and NHS, you know, the very extreme is if somebody doesn't speak up and raise concern, that could lead to patient harm, potentially fatal in some instances. But also if it's something to do with behaviours, inappropriate behaviours, bullying or something, if somebody doesn't speak up about that, that could have a real detrimental impact to the person that's on the receiving end of that bullying, whether that's the pharmacist themselves or somebody else there witnessing it. So that can also have an impact on the wider morale of a team if it's witnessed by more people, etc. So the impact of not speaking up can be minor, but it can be really significant. But also if somebody, you know, if a pharmacist witnesses something and doesn't speak up, that's potentially going to have that impact on themselves as well, holding on to that information, you know, oh gosh, you know, I've seen this, I've heard this, I've not done anything with it because of X, Y and Z. And then if something does happen wider, that can have a real impact on the person that's witnessed that and hasn't been able to speak up as well.
Mark says there could even be professional or legal repercussions as well.
But I think as well, and we see this quite often, is if the regulator becomes involved in a complaint or, you know, through its own investigations, they become aware that a pharmacist was either complicit in the problem or condoned what was going on, they could themselves face fitness to practice allegations for in breach of the standards. If there's a criminal investigation or inquest or fatal accident inquiry, that the pharmacist risks being subject to criticism about their inaction in preventing or reducing the risk of harm.
OK, so reporting problems when you see them is important. But what should your strategy be? If a pharmacist or member of the pharmacy team sees a problem and wants to do something about it, the advice is to start by reporting it within your own organisation.
So it's always advisable to start at the lowest level first through the company's own internal policies. The big organisations tend to have good ones, and the organisation has a responsibility to create the culture and environment where, you know, whistleblowing is effective and dealt with appropriately. It's only if those don't work that you've got other routes to follow. So the other thing I think, and pharmacists are very good at this because of their nature of documenting things, being factual and accurate, is to keep a record of what was said if they are concerned about things. Keep a diary, a log, a chronology. That's always very helpful as a sort of a safety net if things don't work out.
So wherever possible, we say to workers, you know, if you can speak up in your organisation, you're at the lowest level, you know, if you can go to your line manager, you might not be able to do that if your line manager's the problem, for example. You know, if you can find somebody else to speak to in the organisation, whether it's another peer or a supervisor, you know, a guardian that we can come on to, try and do that first. Because if we can resolve things at that lowest level before it becomes this whistleblowing kind of, you know, procedure, then that's what we need to do. Because by solving it, or at least attempting to resolve it first at a local level, you know, that's a better outcome for the people involved, that's a better outcome for the organisation. Obviously, it's financially better, but that's not always possible for some people. Sometimes there is no other option than to go externally. So before a pharmacist decides to go external to the organisation to raise concern, to speak up, to whistleblow, I would say, first of all, take a moment to step back. Have they tried to resolve it internally first? If not, why not? And do they think they could approach somebody internally to raise that concern? If they have tried to raise it internally and it hasn't been resolved, are they clear about why that hasn't been resolved? You know, maybe they didn't go to the right person. But, you know, if after all those reflections they think, no, I absolutely need to take this externally, then that's their decision to make.
But sometimes, if speaking up internally doesn't seem to have had an effect, it might be time to go outside the organisation. So what people or organisations can pharmacists go to? Here's Mark again.
There's a whole list of what's called prescribed external organisations that pharmacists and anybody else can whistleblow. There's a huge list. There's things like, in the financial interest, Financial Conduct Authority. But for sort of pharmacy, it's usually regulators, the MHRA, the CQC, Health and Safety Executive. Within the NHS, there's the National Guardian's Office and the Freedom to Speak Up network. So there's those type of organisations they can go to externally that fall within the framework of organisations that can be whistleblown to. So it's important that if the internal mechanisms don't work and that doesn't prove successful, that there are external ones that they can turn to, or they can go to in the first instance if they don't think that what they're doing is going to be effective or is going to put them in jeopardy. I would always suggest that for pharmacists to best protect themselves in terms of making a whistleblowing complaint, that they get some advice first from a variety of sources, whether that's a trade union, a legal advisor, or a charity such as Protect.
Beth has advice for how to find a Freedom to Speak Up guardian.
So if they are in a healthcare organisation that has a Freedom to Speak Up guardian, depending on what organisation you're in, depends on how you get in touch with the guardian. It's generally either an email direct to the guardian. Some organisations have sort of electronic platforms where you get in touch with them and different things, but that should all be available, the information within the organisation. So they could contact the Freedom to Speak Up guardian. The guardian acts as an impartial person, and the guardian can then either raise the concern on the person's behalf. They could link the person in with the relevant people and support them to then have those conversations. So not be part of them, but to support them to go and have those conversations. If a pharmacist is in an organisation and they're not sure if there's a guardian or not, they can go on the National Guardian's Office website. And then there's an area on the website that's called Find My Guardian. So they can put in the organisation or they could just put in the area, and then it will list the guardians and what organisations they are in and give contact details. And if there isn't, then we can say, actually, there isn't a guardian in your area or your workplace, but we can signpost, these people to contact. So they can always do that as well.
Pharmacists and other members of the pharmacy team could have legal rights and protections after speaking up, depending on what's been reported. The Public Interest Disclosure Act protects staff from detriment if they make what's called a qualifying or protected disclosure to a prescribed person or organisation. But there are several criteria that must be met for that.
So that very much depends on what it is they're speaking up about. But for it to fall under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, it would need to be a criminal offence, a breach of a legal obligation, miscarriage of justice, danger to the health and safety of any individual, damage to the environment, or deliberate concealment of any of those listed. So yes, if it falls under PIDA, then they would be protected from dismissal and detriment.
It's quite specific in terms of how the concern is, what category it falls into, and whether it qualifies as a qualifying disclosure, which is why I'm always suggesting that people take some advice somewhere if that's what they want to do, because you've got to make sure it fits into the category of a qualifying disclosure. You've got to have a sort of a reasonable belief in what it is you're raising, and it has to be in the public interest. So it's not a personal issue, it's a public interest, and that means it has to also affect others, other workers, patients, general public. Something that's personal to you is unlikely to be counting in the public interest. We had a member who was a long-term locum in a particularly large company, who'd raised concerns about what was going on in the pharmacy on patient safety aspects, and had her bookings terminated. So that was the detriment. She raised it, and that went through to a tribunal, found in favour of the pharmacist. It was demonstrated that because of the disclosure that she'd made, that resulted in the bookings being cancelled, and was successful in that case and was awarded compensation. If you are dismissed, you can get some very swift action, and it's called an interim relief application. And again, to bring it to life, I'll give you an example. We were supporting a pharmacist who, after taking advice from ourselves, flagged up concern to the owner of an online pharmacy that was employing pharmacists whose clinical practice was not great, and that was causing concern for our member working there as a pharmacist. He raised his concerns to the owner, who promptly dismissed him. It was a very dramatic moment, really. You called into a meeting to discuss the concerns and was essentially told to pack his bags and leave the pharmacy. In those circumstances, an application can be made, and this is what happened for an interim relief application, and that's a very quick process that has to be made within 7 days of the dismissal. What that does is it makes a decision based on what's available on whether that person is likely to succeed in a claim later on, because there isn't enough time to get to the bottom of the full facts. And that person can be reinstated back to the organisation. The tribunal can compel the organisation to re-employ that individual pending the hearing to decide whether it's a proper claim.
But even if there are some protections for people who speak up, the idea of doing so can obviously be intimidating. In small organisations especially, it can leave you feeling unprotected. I asked Beth if it's possible to report a concern anonymously.
Yes, there absolutely is a place for anonymous reporting, because some people are just too terrified to do it any other way. But there can be limitations with it, and that's really important to understand that before taking the step to anonymous reporting. Some organisations use an electronic platform that allows for anonymous reporting, but there can still be a two-way conversation, but it is anonymous. So the person would register, send the email in, it would go to the Guardian, but the Guardian doesn't see any name or anything, it's just got like this case number. But the Guardian can actually respond to that, and it will go back to that person, and they can have dialogue. The other way to report anonymously, if an organisation doesn't have any kind of electronic way to do it, is back to basics, pen to paper, write your concern down, send it into the CEO or whoever the person wants to send it to, with no name or where it's come from, and raise the concern that way. Put as much detail in as possible so that people, the organiser, whoever it goes to, can try and follow up on that concern, because there will be no option to come back to you. But also have the sense of recognising that if they do that anonymous concern, that they also won't necessarily be able to get any feedback on what actions were taken.
Speaking up anonymously might feel safer, but it clearly has limitations. On the other hand, if your name is out there on a complaint, there can be consequences.
Sadly, some people do face repercussions for speaking up, even if that is just internally, whether that's being overlooked for promotion, things like that, being treated differently, so they might suddenly sense that people are speaking to them differently, or they're being dismissed from conversations or meetings, that kind of thing. It could be that they face more severe detriment, so potentially some kind of dismissal or, that kind of thing.
It might sound unfair that someone speaking up about an important concern could be penalised like that. That's why it's important to get advice from a relevant organisation like the Pharmacists Defence Association or another trade union before you do anything. But of course, speaking up can be very positive.
Policies can be changed, processes can be changed. We can see improvements to worker experience, and the workers feel valued, they feel that their voice is heard and listened to, even if the changes aren't always what they want. But there's that feedback loop, so somebody speaks up, managers, whoever it is, listen and then acknowledge. Changes either happen or the explanation is given as to why the changes can't happen. That person knows that they were heard, and that ripple effect then goes through the organisation. Morale increases, sickness reduces, retention, is better. You've got a better working environment. And when we've got a better working environment, and an environment of workers that feel valued and empowered to speak, they provide the best care delivery that they can, and then the impact on the patient is evident, and it improves patient safety all round.
As you can see, whether or not to speak up is not an easy decision to make. Navigating your choices can be difficult and stressful, but it's important to know that support is available.
So if they speak up through the Guardian is trained to be able to signpost to support. So whether that's employee assistance support, occupational health support, depends what it is, that is happening to them. So there is support available. Again, it depends on the organisation and where they're speaking up. If a pharmacist is in a pharmacy in a village or something, a small area that doesn't have processes in place, then it's going to be difficult for them to get very specific support locally to them. But what I would say again is they need to feed into, so like NHS England Speak Up team and say, is there any support for me, there? And hopefully they can signpost them to relevant support. But certainly within larger organisations, the organisations where there's guardians, there's that wellbeing support, the occupational health support, those kind of things that they can be referred into.
You've got trade unions because they're well used to supporting members. I talk from our own experience in that, we have dedicated and trained staff that help people through that journey. The PDA is a defence association, and we're also a trade union. So we have 40,000 members. We've grown over the years, and we provide a broad range of services as a defence association and as a trade union.
Hopefully, this has given you a good sense of when and how to raise concerns if you see something. But you might be the person someone's reporting an issue to. Beth has some advice on how to handle that situation.
So if somebody comes to you with a concern, it's really important that, first of all, you take the time to listen to their concern. So first and foremost, make the time and space. So if you can't do it there and then, let's get time in our diary where we can focus on this and, we can talk it through. And then make sure you're in a room or an office, wherever it might be, that you're not going to be disturbed. So whether it's your own office and you put some kind of do not disturb sign on the outside, that you're not going to be disturbed. So again, you can give your full attention. And then they're going to share something with you. You don't know what it's going to be. So it's really important to listen to understand. Listen to everything they've got to say. It's their truth. It's what they're telling you. If it's something about yourself, maybe it's something you've done as a manager, for example, don't be defensive. Just listen, take that feedback. And then depending on what the concern is, it might be something that's really easy to deal with, and you could say to them, okay, thank you for sharing this. Actually, this isn't something I've thought about or considered, and I'll have the conversation with, X, Y, and Z. And we'll see if we can resolve this. If it's something and you're really not sure what to do with the information they've given you, be honest with them. Tell them that you're not sure about what to do and that you need to get guidance from either a senior colleague or it might be HR, and then have the conversation with them about confidentiality. So if you say you're going to go get guidance and you go get that guidance and that person tells you need to do X, Y, and Z to resolve it, don't just go and do X, Y, and Z and not tell the person that you've done X, Y, and Z. Make sure you go back and feedback, because that's really important. It's hard. It takes courage. It's the right thing to do, but getting to that point of actually being able to then share those concerns with somebody, that takes a lot of courage, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And when we do our training for our guardians, we say to them, if somebody comes to you and speaks up, you need to thank them, because it will have taken them a lot of courage to do that and to get to that point to be able to speak up.
It's really important for organisations to have a proper whistleblowing culture so that people feel able to use the internal processes, have confidence in those, and see that what they're saying produces the results that they want to. Because otherwise they'll just go externally, and it means that the company doesn't have an opportunity to put things right in the workplace, and they're dealing with an external investigation rather than dealing with matters internally and properly, and making sure that it's dealt with to the satisfaction of the individual raising the concerns. So culture within organisations is paramount.
I think that's a good place to end. Speaking up is not a small thing. As Beth says, it takes courage and can have consequences. But if a pharmacist or another member of the pharmacy team sees a problem at work that affects themselves, patients or colleagues and could be considered public interest, they have an obligation to speak up about it. Most problems can be dealt with by reporting it to a manager within the organisation, so be sure to explore every avenue there first. If you think you need to speak up outside your organisation, seek advice from an independent external party like a trade union or charity. Then see if you have a Freedom to Speak Up guardian or someone similar available to you. We'll put links to these in the show notes, where you'll also find links to relevant PJ articles and other resources. Our thanks to Beth Carter from the National Guardian's Office and Mark Pitt from the Pharmacists Defence Association for their contributions. And thanks to you for listening. Until the next learning episode, it's goodbye from us.